Oh, my pleasure as always. And I just totally amazed about the technology, how we're able to do this. But having been a retired college professor, I'm used to moving around when you're talking and kind of emphasizing your points and so forth. And it's a little bit more, it's a little different trying to do it this format where you're not moving around, and it obviously would be a distraction otherwise. But anyway, adopting this new technology, we're talking about history, the history of Medina County. And as the book kind of outlines, my timeline book, it's 200 years of faith, family, community, and democratic principles. Wrote the book and published it in order to celebrate the bicentennial. 200 years of the formation of Medina County, its organization, and so forth. And it highlighted some key events, not only nationally, but statewide as well as also locally. And the important thing to try to develop themes from these little, if you will, posts in time. And the job of a historian is trying to put these things together so they have some meaning, develop some themes. Today, I decided what I want to do is really talk about some historical themes I think of interest. That emerges from the story of Medina County. And many of these stories I will point out, I'll talk about today, will be in a future book that I put together that really is a compilation of well, stories that I tell or columns that I've done for Helping Hands Foundation. It's done every 3 months, quarterly over the last number of years. I've tried to talk about at the state level and tie it into history. And all those articles are available on my website, stevehambley.com. You can ignore the political part on that because you can actually go into the full text. Some of the stories I tell today have been featured in there, and in the book will be actually much more detailed, more expanded version of that. And I'm hoping to get that published next year. The proceeds of this book that I had have all gone to Project Learn, and I would intend that the proceeds of the next book would likewise do the same thing. Get to support adult literacy and, of course, the love of history. So what I want to do is talk about our. Colleen, want to go to the next slide? It and the Did you move it? There you go. Okay. Basically, what we have in the historical themes, like I say, I want to point out is really the formation and the organization of Medina County. And there's some untold stories of the history of Medina County you won't hear or see anywhere else, but really is a story of our pioneers and what they're trying to do to not only amongst themselves help one another, but also combat nature, to alter nature, to change it and form the land into a way that they can use it productively, their families and their future. And of course, how Northeast Ohio and Medina County fit into that. Now, today, you're going to hear a number of presentations from people that talk about various aspects of that, our early pioneer history. Secondly, I'll also concentrate a bit on this in the transportation, the growth and development, how our growth and development was tied to the ability of not only people to move here, also to go back and forth out of Medina County, how our business growth and our agriculture was tied to the ability to move in and out of the county and indeed further develop. And then lastly, of untold stories about a conflict between people and cultures, the old rural versus the new urban and suburban. And there's some examples of that that I'll give in the presentation. Colleen, next slide. So what we have is Northwest or Northeast Ohio was really part of was the Connecticut Western Reserve. Northeast Ohio wasn't really part of what was called the Old Northwest Territory. That was the organization of Ohio, future Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. But we were never really part of that organization. From 1776, the founding of our country, to 1800, the state of Connecticut claimed it. Northeast Ohio was not included in the Ordinance of 1785 or the Ordinance of 1787. The Congress, under the Confederation of the United States, formed and said this is how government will be structured. So we were a part of it because we were not part of it because we were literally part of Connecticut. But we were on a phantom zone. You want to go ahead and go to the next slide? Next slide, Colleen. Oh, there we go. All right. for conflicting land claims. The problem is everybody in the colonials and in the various colonies were claiming land to the west, and so they would literally take decades for these claims to be satisfied. For like Connecticut to decide what part they were claiming a lot. Virginia was claiming, North Carolina. You can see the list. They were claiming all these future lands, and there was great conflict. It had to do with the monarchy and so forth, and the charters that they had been provided, and so these had to be resolved in a way that people moving the West actually have clear titles that they could acquire the land and be able to sell it and also be able to give it to their successors. So there's all these conflicts. And to give you an example, Colleen, next slide. The next we have these conflicting claims like Connecticut. And you can see in the map, it goes all the way from Connecticut. It jumps over New York and considers the future of Pennsylvania, Ohio, to Michigan and Indiana, and goes westward. And you kind of see the Northeast Ohio is part of that. Where we're at now was part of that conflicting claim. Next slide. In the Land Ordinance of 1785, you have it was adopted by Congress, and it really laid the foundation of land policy in the United States. Up until basically the Homestead Act of 1862, this is the type of way that the United States furthered the development to the West. It set up a standardized system where settlers could purchase title to the land in an undeveloped West. Next slide. And here we have a map of what we call the historical divisions of Ohio. Here, Western Reserve, which was where we're at now. There's the Firelands. That's all part of the Connecticut Reserve. But then you see Congress lands. You see Virginia as settlement of their disputes, if you will, of claiming part of Ohio. The military tract that was formed. You have the Ohio Land Company that was purchased, and so forth. So all these lands. You also have the Wayne's Treaty Line, which dealt with Indians, the Native Americans. That was where the government, the national government, settled disputes with the Indians as to where the Indians or the Native Americans would reside and where settlers could come in. So you can see very clearly that we're kind of in a phantom zone or no man's land. Next slide. So the government surveys between Connecticut Western Reserve and the Old West Northwest Ordinance of 1787 differed. Township size is different. You will notice, and you can see in the map upper right, Connecticut Western Reserve, they're 5 mile square. And look at the squares that are just south of us. They're 6 mile square, actually. They're a little bit bigger. Likewise, the difference was there was no sectors reserved in those squares for public education or churches in the Western Reserve. In the other parts remaining of Ohio that was surveyed and part of those government surveys, there was always some sectors preserved for public education and for churches. In the Western Reserve, essentially, we were proprietor property. This was part of the property that would be sold off, and then if the settlement wanted to devote land to public education or for future churches, well, that was up to them. Next slide. And this shows you a little bit more detail of that, if you will, the disconnect. When we look at the 5 mile square versus 6 mile squares, just to the south of us. And you can see, of course, the future Medina County. Next square. The Western Reserve essentially was in a phantom zone. From 1795 to 1800, the Connecticut General Assembly had ceded all its claims in May of 1786, except for the Western Reserve. So they had that section that we were in, and Congress accepted the Connecticut partial cession. There was a considerable opposition from New York and Virginia, because Virginia and New York were still claiming land, and there was always this historic dispute. As I said, it took literally decades. But Congress was able to accept, and Connecticut in September 1795, the purpose of making this claim is they wanted to sell the land. They needed the money in terms of supporting their education fund and other state functions. So they sold it to an organized group of basically prospectors, people that were proprietors that wanted to speculate on the land, either come and settle here or likewise settle and sell. They wanted to have the land. So you had the Western Reserve land that was given or sold to for $1.2 million, Connecticut Land Company. They really didn't have a clear title. So from 1795 to 1800, Connecticut really failed to exercise its judicial and political jurisdiction over the reserve and created a phantom zone where anybody moving here was not going to really have clear title. The Connecticut Assembly continued to essentially, once they released the control of the federal government, they tried to turn it over in 1797. Congress Well, they couldn't come to agreement, so they did nothing. 1798, the land company went to Congress and said, hey, we need to have this jurisdiction, and we'll give the federal government jurisdiction to this land so we can develop it and sell it, have clear title. Congress continued to fight about it and did nothing. Well, 1800, they were finally able to actually settle this dispute. John Marshall, who was a congressman from Virginia, was able to, he was a Federalist, working with other Federalists as well as President Adams, trying to settle this through what's called the Easement Act of 1800, or the Quieting Act, which officially accepts the Western Reserve as part of the Northwest Territory. Essentially, from that period of 1795 to 1800, everybody that was starting to settle here was about 1,000 people. We're calling this New Connecticut. Moses Cleveland came, and as he was sent out over here, they did a toast in celebration of the Western Reserve, and they kept calling it New Connecticut. We're looking actually to become another state. Well, this law quieted that also. It not only settled the dispute, it says, no, it's going to be part of the old Northwest Territory. The idea was that they wanted to create this county, Humboldt County, create this area. Governor St. Clair, who was a Federalist, actually was not interested in seeing Ohio become a state. He fought it for several years because the Federalists were in the political dispute with what's called the Democratic Republicans, shorthand Republicans, which were actually Jeffersonians and Madisons, followed them. So you have that division, the partisan division. It became a partisan issue as well as a regional issue. But largely it was partisan. 85% of the Federalists voted yes for accepting and putting into Ohio, the Northwest Territory. And the Senate, 76% of the Federalists voted yes. Of course, Republicans or the Jeffersonians were on the other side, didn't want to see this happen because the Democratic Republicans were largely in control of the southern part of the Northwest Territory. Ohio was largely going to be Federalists. So you have this, if you will, this mix of political, if you will, struggle going on. Now, eventually, this would be settled once the Quieting Act, and then by 1802, had enough population to have a constitutional convention in November. So you have, as it develops, the process. And so when we talk about the state of Ohio at our statehood day, what we celebrate, there's several dates because it was in dispute. In April 30th, 1802, you had passage of the Federal Enabling Act that said, Ohio, you can now form, or the signing of the Ohio Constitution by the convention in November 1802. There's the passage of an act extending federal laws to the state of Ohio in 1803. March 1st, 1803, organization of the First Ohio General Assembly. And on March 3rd, the congressional resolution giving consent final modification of the Enabling Act, which effect was allow Ohio to enter as a 17th state. Next, but the point of this discussion is that, well, Congress overlooked a critical part of the statehood process. Actually, because of the disputes between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans and what was going on within the federal government, they legally never completed the congressional ratification of the first Constitution, which is a necessary step. So as we go on, we were still entered in the union, and we became very active participant, but we never had that last legal step. The last legal step actually happened in 1953. The resolution of the 83rd Congress confirmed the date, confirmed when that, of course, that the Ohio Constitution was acknowledged. That was, of course, the first day of the General Assembly to meet. You'll see every day when we celebrate March 1st as Ohio Statehood Day, every proclamation by a governor references this bill going back to 1953, which basically gave us the confirmation that we were part of the union retroactively. So which is kind of a little interesting story. This kind of shows you sometimes government work is never done completely. As we're a founding state, we had to deal with it as pioneers, and the state had to deal with, of course, taxation. One of the first property taxes that was the first property tax in order to provide money for the state came about to also deal with property taxes, to deal with revenues, and they created different classifications of property. As property was developed, became more well, obviously more expensive, but likewise also more tax worthy, provided more taxes. Farmers, as they were developing, there was a time that Ohio had so many course, they said the squirrel could go from Cincinnati up to Northeast Ohio without ever touching the ground because there was that many trees. Well, as the trees were, if you will, deforested and the land was developed, farmers were getting their crops, and the biggest enemy of a farmer were squirrels. So the state of Ohio declared war on squirrels, what it came down to. In 1807, they decided every male person of military age had to kill at least 100 squirrels per year, deliver their hides to the township when they paid their property taxes. And if they didn't, actually, we're going to have to pay some additional money per hide for not doing that. They got a tax credit for those hides. They created this tax loophole, and anything less than 100 hides meant you owed 3 cents per squirrel. They also said that, well, if you go beyond the 100 squirrel minimum, you'll get 3 cents per skin on your next year's taxes. And it apparently was such a great incentive that actually the state of Ohio started seeing declining revenues to the point by 1807 decided, nah, we can't afford to do this anymore. It's not like they were running out of squirrels, but they were saying basically, hey, we're running out of money and we need this money. So they ended the tax break. So they, in other words, if you will, to offset, even though they had a public purpose of if you will, uh, decreasing the squirrel population, said, okay, well, enough's enough. We still have to run government. So it ended the tax break, and they eliminated the required squirrel hide bounty in early 1810. Next slide. Ohio likewise tried to fund improvements, both I'll just say commercial or personal, as well as public. And they did it through a lottery system. The first lottery was in 1807, was the Cuyahoga-Muskingum Lottery. We're not the only state to have tried that. Other states were doing it in the colonial times. That was a way to raise money for big projects. Ohioans had to buy enough lottery tickets. It didn't happen because Ohio had a very cash poor economy. There was no drawing in the winter. Eventually, they bought the tickets. People that bought tickets were refunded, and lotteries were attempted for other local projects. Being cash poor, we really did not very successful. Every lottery, special lottery, had to be authorized by legislation by the General Assembly. In 1830, the General Assembly banned them by statute. Eventually, they had an overall prohibition written into the Constitution in the 1851 Constitution, which was updated. So then in the 1970s, we brought back a lot different kind of lottery for different purposes. Next slide. You know, Medina County was not really the shape it is now. Originally, it was basically a rectangle, and it included a lot more townships than what we're accustomed to. I have two maps here, but let me go through and kind of can show you the transition from 1814 to 1845. Originally in 1812, next slide, whenever Medina County was formed out of Portage County, it was that rectangular position. Next slide. Here we have the first slide shows you the Medina County settlement in 1812. Those are in the yellow. By 1812, which was when it was organized, you had people settled in Liverpool, Harrisville, Richfield, Bath, Norton. Those townships were part of Medina County. We would keep this rectilinear, and you can see that I've got the first settlement year as well as the organized year for each of those. Next slide. You can see by 1818, which is when we were formally organized as a county. County commissioners were elected, and we had our county offices. Other areas started to be developed. It's not that those squares weren't surveyed; they were in existence, but there was no settlement yet. So you have, if you will, a pattern of settlement that starts to emerge. A lot of it has to do because it was proprietors. Some proprietors moved into the Western Reserve. They didn't live in Medina County. They had the land, and they eventually had to sell it off. So some land sold off. Some took a number of years to settle, much big parcels. And so 1818, you have these townships that are settled, but then you have in the brackets when they were organized, which means that they had enough population to actually have township trustees and others, constables elected. Next slide. Next, we have 1828, and it shows that next slide, Colleen. Sorry. 1828, this is next level of settlement. I've got 1828 because to the east, we have the canal. The canal is developed, and people start to move in, particularly to the eastern part of the county. They start to move in, and many parts of our county become basically populated with people that are moving, and then coming in and developing, of course, selling off other property, having children, and so forth. We have that. And then we look at the shape of the Medina County as it originally, the next slide, that really settlement to 1840, every place had already been settled. All of these, except for a couple townships like Troy Township, not been quite organized. But all of these have now been settled and organized with townships. Let's go to the next slide. Medina County had a changing shape. Not only, as we know, is this rectangular, but we ended up losing and gaining townships. Next slide, please. There we go. There we go. 1822 to 1827, we had Lorain County was taken a little bit out of it. We have this, we have Rochester and Huntington Township, Troy and Sullivan Township. But we don't, likewise, you've got Penfield and Grafton Township that are not part of Medina County now. Up until, this is the shape of Medina County from 1822 to 1827. Next slide. And then from 1827 to 1840, they decided to lop off some townships to our west. Spencer and Homer, which are now part of our county, were not part of it. They were part of Lorain County. But to our east, we had Richfield Township, Bath Township, Copley Township, Norton Township. Norton Township had actually a connection to the Ohio Canal, Ohio Erie Canal, and it was part of a very active, thriving commercial enterprise. Next slide. So that would up in 1840, they decided to form Summit County. So Summit County and its formation took Richfield, Bath, Copley, and Norton Township. And here we have, up until present day, the shape of Medina County. Troy Township were added to Ashland County in 1846. But likewise, as from 1840, our shape we know as Medina County has remained the same. And so the next map kind of shows you currently where we're at is our townships, and of course with the growth of the villages and cities since then, as well as the founding dates of those. Next slide. Let me talk quickly about the population growth and kind of give you a highlights. And you can see from 1818 all the way down to 2010 how much we've grown and when we have exploded. But I want you to note, in 1850, we peaked. We peaked for the 19th century. We rose up to 24,441, but then we went down in population. People started to move away. Other events, such as the Civil War, caused people to move away and then not return. For other opportunities to the West and elsewhere. We became connected and part of that growth of the development of the West. You remember 1849, you got that growth, massive growth to the West, the California gold rush in the 1850s. People left to find and explore, and their children left to explore and take opportunities elsewhere. And then it stayed about the same until we get into the 20th century. Really, we don't return to that number until between 1910 and 1920. Next slide. Let me briefly talk, why move Medina County? Is it we had affordable and fruitful land, or were we a land of refuge? And so what I want to point out, most people have not heard this story, some have, next slide please, is we've all heard of global climate change. We know about the polar vortex. We know about what happens. And really, we had a cataclysmic event in 1814 and 1815, the explosion of volcanoes, the Mayon volcano and the Mount Tambora volcanic eruption. Mount Tambora eruption blew off the top 4,000 feet of the mountaintop. Would you please, next slide. It had reached a height of 14,000 feet, which was one of the tallest peaks in the Indonesian archipelago. And it basically, after the explosion, it measured about 9,300 feet, 2/3 of the previous height. That explosion produced so much pollution. It destroyed that top 1/3. It brought a large crater 3 miles wide and a half-mile deep. Next one. What it did literally is produced a volcanic winter. These two massive volcanic explosions from 1814 and 15 became the largest eruptions in the last 1,300 years. It created this volcanic winter. Tens of thousands of people were wiped out by the hostile climatic events. It left New England states. Many of these people left there. There was a shortage of food. There was a shortage of firewood. Traveled westward, the Midwest, in search of more hospitable climate, richer soil, better growing conditions. The eruption, just to give you a context, next slide, it basically literally created a year without summer, not only for the United States, also the world. It lowered the global temperatures, created severe climate anomalies. There was snow in unusual months. You'll see in the timeline, there's references in Medina County of this events. Most agricultural crops were ruined in North America. Famine in several countries. An estimated 100,000 deaths resulted in Europe alone. We talk about a deadly strain of cholera hit the Bay of Bengal in India, and eventually it spread across the world. We're familiar with epidemics and pandemics now. With this back then in the 19th century, the start of this cholera actually, tens of millions of people died from this Bengal cholera all over the world because it spread. Mount Tambora eruption is placed as among the greatest environmental disaster ever to befall mankind. Next slide. This shows you a map of what we call the typical jet stream, summer jet stream. And you can see that during a typical summer jet stream pattern, during the summer, the warm and humid air from the east for the East Coast goes up and rises, and of course most of the storms stay north of Europe. But because of the summer of 1816, the jet stream pattern changed because of this volcanic winter. It actually, the dry, cold Arctic air came down the northeast, and like a conveyor belt, it had a whole lot of string of storms that ended up hitting Europe. So in the northern hemisphere, we were struck with this pattern, and that produced that cold. Next. Why move to Medina County? In July of 1816, Medina County started with the snow and ice, without summer, snowed every month of the year, the greatest subsistence crisis of the Western world. You had this dry fog, and you can see these recorded events in Connecticut and the East Coast and so forth. Thousands of people wiped out by the hostile climate events of New England. What they did is they started to travel westward, because remember, this pattern's coming from the west. We were the first ones to start to emerge from this volcanic winter. So by the time you get to 1817, 1818, 1819, we're starting to recuperate, and people are starting to move west because they can no longer stand the bad climates and what's going on in the Northeast. Likewise, in the next slide, you have, because of settled titles and because of the land company, they basically are out there selling the land. Not only is it cheap for prop, these are advertisements that are Hartford Current, but they advance money on Connecticut property. The terms of payments are made easy and agreeable. So, next slide. Where did we grow early on? Early on, we started to grow, next slide, please. We started to grow on in Liverpool, in Medina, in Wadsworth Township, in Sharon, and Guilford, and so forth. Those are large headers. You can see it's where we didn't really grow as fast. That was literally to the west. When we look at Chatham, Spencer, and this is from 1818 to 1840, York Township, Litchfield, and so forth. So we kind of rank, and you kind of see as Medina County started to grow, largely end up in those towards the east for various reasons. Part of it had to do, next slide, had to do with access and where the if you were the pattern of developed, where people came. The settlers in many of these areas in the northern part came along the Rocky River watershed. They kind of followed the rivers and followed the roads that would work their way into Medina County. Likewise, you had some that are coming from the east along that southern sub watershed. Now, this I have for you is the Lake Erie River, Ohio River Water Basin Divide, which is how the water basins work and so forth. But you can kind of see is typically the pattern of settlement would go along that. And so you have that southern tier, you have the northern, and there's people coming over to us from the east. Next slide. Hinckley Township, which we'll hear a little bit more about later. I think you're going to get presentations about the Hinckley Hunt. I'm not going to go into it, but this shows that what people had to overcome. As they were moving here, well, they had to displace the Native American Indians had long moved. They ended up having to displace, of course, the wildlife. And this is one of those famous Hinckley Hunt events. But what really, next slide, what really did made accelerated the growth up into the 1840s was really the transportation events. And what I want to highlight in this part about how transportation, the role it played in the development of Medina County and has continued to up until this day. And you can look at this slide at your leisure, but we'll highlight some of those key events. The first is, the next slide, is really the Ohio Canal, the Ohio Erie Canal, completed in Akron, 1827, and the nearby Clinton, 1828. It provided, and our connection to it was over in Norton called New Portage. New Portage would become later Barberton. That was part of Medina County. But it had a great impact on the development as well as commercial development, but also agriculture. In 1827, the price of a bushel of wheat the local farmer could get jumped from 5 cents to $1 for a bushel almost overnight. So this, having access to the markets, increased the value of that produce and certainly allowed people to be able to market the agriculture to grow and people to develop. Canal had a fundamental change to the economy and the development of not only Medina County, but Ohio. In fact, so much that the early state seal of Ohio, created in 1841, had the canal boat. The state seal is used up until the 1870s. It is placed in the 1861 Ohio State House Rotunda skylight. Hard to see, but this is a picture of it. But it's also found at the base of the Speaker's platform in the Ohio House of Representatives, showing the canal boat as part of the state seal. The United States likewise had another fantastic development in transportation that affected not only Ohio and the nation, but Medina County, where we have the development of railroads. You can see from 1870 to 1890, even though we didn't grow in population, we connected up with the world in terms of transportation, the steam railroad. Those are the top times. Steam railroads in Ohio, next slide. Every county in 1883 was accessible by railroad. The population of Ohio tremendously grew from 1870 to 1888. Remember, Medina County didn't really grow, but our connections did. Our agricultural output increased. Earnings of railroads grew tremendously as well. So basically, they had the same economic effect as canals did on agricultural products. People got more money for their agricultural product than they ever did before, and hence our wealth. Here we have Poor's Manual of Railroads, next slide, of 1885, shows that Medina County has mainline connections to the national railroad system. These are the ones that go in and out nationally. And you can see through Wadsworth, up through Seville and Medina and elsewhere, and also over through Lodi. Next slide. In 1890, we had pretty much the complete network of railroad that we're going to have. It's not going to grow beyond this. This meant that these communities were now accessible to not only other parts of Ohio, but the world economy. And this was a very important, if you will, event in terms of the economy, in terms of agriculture, as well as people being able to come and reside here. Next, railroads and towns had an impact on one another. Our towns in northeast Ohio, Western Reserve, has that typical central green or commons area. Medina, Lodi, we have Seville. We always have these in the counties that were created in the 19th century, had these town centers. Typically had irregular size shaped town blocks. Smaller blocks were generally toward the center, and as you get larger blocks in periphery. Railroad, when it was built, normally occupied a position halfway between the common and the edge of the town. The normal situation is they would basically have a broad curve, would through many of these roads would focus on the green. Next slide. It shows a map of Medina Village in 1897, and you can see the outline of that broad curve of the railroads running through it. And the parcels more towards the middle of the right of that screen is the town center with the small blocks. As you go out towards the railroads you have that broad curve. Likewise, Lodi Village, 1897, has pretty much the same, next slide, has the same kind of pattern of development. By 1897, with the railroads going through, that broad curve, and of course, the smaller parcels between that and the town center. Next slide. Next, I would call it's called the age of speed and mobility, where we have access to our people through innovations technology of the railroad, being the electric railroad. The Southwestern Interurban completed in Brunswick. You have the Northern Ohio Traction and Light Company completed in Wadsworth. And then, of course, we'll talk about the roads, our highway systems in a little bit. But first, did you know that Ohio, next slide, was we were the king of the interurban network. We, the peak of the interurban industry, Ohio led the nation with almost 2,800 miles of electric rails. The nearest state was Indiana with 1,800 track miles. And we were connected, as you can see by this map, to this massive network of speedy access. Largely, when we look at their access, is for multiple purposes, largely for passenger. Medina was a interurban county in as much as we had two of the major interurbans of Northeast Ohio, Cleveland and Southwestern, 126 miles, Northern Ohio Traction Light, 256. Wadsworth was connected from the east into Akron. Many of its residents were able to travel there in 45-minute or 50-minute or even an hour ways. In Medina County, you could get up to Cleveland, you could go down towards Mansfield or down to Worcester and so forth. Once again, 45 minutes to an hour, be able to go back and forth. Likewise, you had the ability to, not only for passenger traffic, but also dairy products and freight and so forth. We became actually a dairy county. We had a humongous number of produce, places we would grow fruit and so forth. But likewise, milk was a huge commodity. But here we can see that there was if you will, there was a time period in the next slide about when that would rise. Up until 1920, it was a growing number of passengers would be carried along the southwestern system. But starting in 1920, competition from trucks, competition from passenger cars, as it started to emerge, reduced the numbers of people utilizing the system. So you get by the 1930s, it's dropped off considerably. Next slide. The next slide kind of shows you, at least in terms of the revenues as a total, that as a passenger amount of money came in and started to decline in the 1920s, freight and milk started to make up for offset that, but still it was such a declining revenues that eventually the systems would have to close down because they were not sustained by government, but they were enterprise, they were companies and so forth. So we have the 1920s, as I pointed out next slide, the emergence of a car culture. We have how state starts to provide funding. We have a county engineer that becomes largely responsible for roads in addition to surveying and for maps and so forth. We have a responsibility too of the state starting to more and more highways. Medina County, as you can see by this little map, they decided in 1922 they're going to do 7 trunk highways. Those trunk highways, 42 and 18, go through Medina County. Those were the major roads that Ohio was going to devote money towards and develop and so forth. We had a growing revenue source that came from registration fees. Understand, up until the late 20s, property taxes were assessed against vehicles. Whenever there was you had a property tax applied to your house, your car was also taxed on its value up until 1928. In 1925, the states decided, besides license taxes, we're going to tax also motor fuel. And so those license fees, the registration fees, as well as the vehicle tax was going to start to be used for improving the highways. And by the time we get to the Great Depression, the property tax is eliminated on the passenger vehicle, but we have a rising number of passenger cars and likewise the growing improvement of highways through Medina County. Next slide, please. Transportation accelerated the growth and development. That's the theme of the 20th century. And it also rose to a conflict between basically between the old rural versus the new suburban. One of the symbols of that, or I think one of the most noteworthy ones, next slide, was what we call feuding farmers in Brunswick. I wrote an article in Helping Hands about it, and I think it's been, I've noticed that this was a national AP wire photo showing a guy in his basically coveralls holding a shotgun with a bulletin board saying 32 by 8 sign warning visitors, hey, welcome to Medina County. We're the home of garbage-fed pigs and garbage being dumped on the ground for Cuyahoga County. The sign was on a 100-acre property on 42, what we know as Mapleside Farm. He had a 100-acre farm. He was known as the gentleman farmer. Elmer Eisen was the founder, and he decided to build this in protest. This pig farm was being a host of so much garbage. All the neighbors were having problems with this. Next slide. It was a 250-acre farm, 1,500 hogs, supplied 30 tons of garbage. What it came down to is the health department first sided with the hog farmer, not with the people. It then created this sign. It had nationwide as well as statewide publicity. We became well known is that place where you've got somebody walking to Medina County with a shotgun. The Medina County Gazette, the Chamber of Commerce, we're not really happy with the image that are created for Medina County. This was part of the statewide debate, next slide, of municipal garbage and hog farms. There was this movement early on, when we in the 1930s, they recognized there was a correlation between garbage-fed pigs and trichinosis and illness and cholera. And so nationally, that they started to force the cities and places that were using these kind of hog farms for dumping their garbage, because it was largely food, that we've got to change. We've got to do more about it. Next slide. Notice that we have this, the U.S. Public Health Service called these G-min assignments. Science started to warn people about the health damage. So there was this transition from the rural to the urban, as we're getting more urbanized and garbage was being created humongously. The people on the outside, like Medina County, were kind of, we had great hog farms, but the people living here didn't really care for the smell too much. So the Ohio Public Health Council, next slide, ordered our health district to decide one way or the other if the hog farm was a public nuisance. Eventually, they decided, as I said, with the hog farm, they changed the membership and so forth. The health commissioner was actually forced to resign as part of the controversy, and they reversed it, and they gave the hog farmer 90 days to clean up. But this case went all the way to actually the Ohio Supreme Court, just to let you know of the various lawsuits. Next slide. Next story, just to stay on track here, which is, I think, another indication what it was called the Great Oleomargin Debate. And I won't go too much into it. You can find more details in Helping Hands as well on my website about this oleomargin debate. Go ahead, next slide. About it was the political issue of 1949, and it went to the ballot, initiative petition. What color should oleomargarine be in the store we buy? Then lard, and it was a butter substitute, and you had to put a dye into it and mix it in there to make it yellow, because there was a law opposed that the dairy interest had done way back in 1890 to make sure that margarine was not going to compete against dairy products, against butter. And so people demanded that they want to be able to actually allow the manufacture of this color in there. Now, over decades, Congress as well as the state legislature is trying to deal with this, and we couldn't do anything about it. So eventually the people stepped in 1949, and they said, no, we're going to have a vote on this. And next slide. In 1949, Medina County, actually a majority of people opposed allowing yellow to be put in margarine, largely due to the rural vote. We were a mix. Medina Village and Wadsworth, they were in favor of allowing the yellow color, but the remaining part of the rural area, they didn't like it so much. What it came down to is, overall, it did pass in statewide. 62% said yes. The sale of margarine ought to have yellow if that's what the manufacturer wants to do, make it look more like butter. But it kind of showed you the divide in Medina County. We're half rural, half urban. Next slide. Because of the great developments of not only our road system, likewise outside our county, large-scale employers, northern Medina County, of course, where I reside in Brunswick and Liverpool and Hinckley, grew massively after in the post-World War. Ohio Turnpike in 1955, 65, the interchange and so forth. But you can see how Brunswick exploded after the 1950 next slide. 1950 census. We look at GM plant in Parma, 6,600 workers in 1959. They opened in 48. Ford Brook plant complex. Basically, you had 15,000 workers. A lot of those workers came to Medina County, particularly in Brunswick. We don't have data as where people work and where they worked inside Medina, they resided here, or worked outside Medina County. You see where they reported. And we look at in 1960, 54% worked in Medina County. In 2013, it's flipped. 55% of the workforce outside Medina County. We look in 2010, Brunswick, 65.3% of workers in 2010 living in Brunswick leave Medina County to do their jobs. We're number one ranked in the state. We are linked to the outside economically, and many of the people even here can attest to, yeah, I work outside the county. Colleen, next slide, if you don't mind. When we look here, and then the other statistic is where people moved in the housing and the growth and development. In Medina County, we look from 1954. In 1954, We 1960, 60%, 66% of the households had just moved there in that 6-year period. 66% of the households. That means what happened in development in Medina County in the 1950s, we exploded everywhere. People were houses, people were moving in. And of course, Brunswick was part of that explosion. Next slide. Here we have that the continuation of what I say the feud and farmers was essentially what it comes down to is people decided farms can do one thing. Farmers they sell their land, they could produce products, but likewise part of their bank account and part of their retirement is the sale of that land. Brunswick, as it exploded, it was turning in from a village into a municipality, and there was a division between those that wanted to continue to stay on the farms, have a rural way of life, and those that literally wanted to sell and new houses to be built. We had that explosion, that great pressure. In 1959, after 4 prior attempts, village finally approved formation of Brunswick Village, 25 miles square. The village formed in 1960, but the state law allowed at that time villages to also people to detach from it. And you had farmers deciding that they want to succeed, that they want to no longer be part of the city or the village, the future city, but they want to become and formed a township, which is our essentially that is one of our newest townships. There was 3 successive succession movements. In 1960, 3 elections, as you can see, 2,000 acres, and then another 2,000 acres, and then another 1,900 acres. We've got all these acreages, all these people that are coming down and saying that they no longer want to be part of the municipality, but they want to be part of this township. In July of 1960, Brunswick Village becomes a city, and therefore the law no longer affects them. They can no longer succeed. They can all remove themselves without a vote of city council. But you have, during that mid period of time, you have bunch of islands that are created. Next slide, if you don't mind. Large property owners want that have gone into the city and they want to stay part of it. Essentially, well, they'd like to have water. They get into a contract with the city of Cleveland. They bring water lines, but they also decided to tax themselves in order to have development of a water system. They put a property tax levy of 3.9 mil on themselves, a 1.2 million bond issue, and a $3.4 million project involved 1.9 million in property assessments. And the people in Brunswick City decided we're going to have this water system, and anybody that wants to tap into it will have to come into the city. And hence what we have is the next slide, creation over the years. And actually early on, we have all these little islands. We have all these irregular areas, like 88 different boundaries. You have little populations, little areas where there's a township being surrounded by the city. And over a period of time, next slide, you can see slowly annexation occurs. People decide to go into the city. But there's that continuing struggle between the city of Brunswick, with those property owners that tax themselves, decided they had water, and they extend city services. It created confusion, obviously, for police and fire. So you hear like the feud and farmers continues in a way, even the people that have moved here since. Next slide. We can kind of see where we're at in 2018. We have the formation in Brunswick Hills and development of urbanized areas because the county was able to provide sewer and water and services. They were able to develop. But still, we have as a policy in the city of Brunswick, they're not going to extend the boundaries without annexation and paying into the tax base of Brunswick City. And so it's been kind of like our heritage, if you will, in the last number of years, where I certainly grew up, has been this division. The feud and farmers originally emerged because do you want to stay rural? Do you want to stay, become urban and developed? Continues on in the form of, well, are you going to be within the city and try to keep some of the rural areas, or excuse me, be in the township, or do you want to become still part of the city and you want the urban benefits, basically in terms of fire and police and so forth. So the community still kind of struggles in that way. Many of us kind of look back and go, why should we keep on fighting? Aren't there opportunities to work together? That's kind of like, I will say, not talked about now. It's kind of more of a recent history, but this can kind of help explain. You can see the little islands that still exist. There's basically a barn over there on Grafton Road, is in the township, but all the area is city. So presumably, if the house catches on fire, they call Brunswick City, which is across the street. But if the barn catches on fire, maybe they'll call Brunswick Hills. I don't know. I think they've kind of worked those out, but that's why we have the islands, because of those changes in law and that struggle between urban and rural. And that's the end of the presentation, if you will.